Well, thank you, Garth. It's good to have you all out this evening. And let's see, I've got my handy-dandy remote control. Now, they say it's always good to start out with a little bit of humor. So, how many evolutionists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, it doesn't take any. See, if they wait long enough, it just happens by chance. Okay. That's a lot more probable to happen by chance than the first cell to evolve. Anyway, we don't want to go too long tonight, so we're going to get right into the program. Tonight, we're going to be looking at design in the universe, Big Bang versus biblical creation. Now, I always start out by quoting Richard Lewontin, who gives us a great understanding of the materialist mindset that pervades most of the scientific community today. Now, if you take a poll of scientists across the board, rank and file, we find there's usually about a 60 to 40% split, somewhere around that, of 60% of them saying they're atheist or agnostic, and 40% saying evolution is not the be-all, end-all, there's got to be a creator behind all of this. However, in the polls that they took in the leading scientific affiliations, National Academy of Sciences, American Association for the Advancement of Science, those who are really in the mover and shaker, power broker positions in the scientific community in America, they found that nearly 100% of them said they were atheists or agnostics. So they have the materialist mindset. Of course, atheists have to believe that the physical universe, matter and energy, is the whole of reality. There is no spiritual dimension, therefore there is no spiritual creator, and man himself is just a bag of chemicals. He does not have a spiritual nature at all. So, what do they believe in this regard? Richard Lewontin was very honest in this regard, more so than many of them are in public. But he actually put this in writing. He said, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism." Now again, materialism is a worldview philosophy, one could say a religion. It is the idea that the material universe is the whole of reality. It's not like Madonna, the material girl who likes material goods. That's being materialistic. But materialism is an all-pervasive worldview and philosophy. Now, notice he admits it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Okay, if science doesn't compel them, what does? Well, he said, but on the contrary, that we're forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. Now, a priori simply means prior to looking at any evidence, they've already made up their mind about what they want to believe, which is antithetical to the scientific method. The scientific method, you're supposed to make observations, and then from those observations, a posteriori, in other words, after looking at the evidence, you try to formulate a model, a theory, a hypothesis, a paradigm to explain the data and even to make predictions. However, they've got the cart before the horse. He admits, before they look at anything, they've already made up their mind, materialism is the whole of reality. Now, that, of course, gives credence to the old proverb that there are no eyes so blind as those that refuse to see. You know, if they've already made up their mind before they look at the evidence, why even bother to look at the evidence? You know, I thought science was about the evidence, the facts, the logic, the reasoning. But apparently, for some of them at least, it is not. They've already made up their mind what they want to believe before they look at the evidence. So, an a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. In other words, a supernatural explanation is ruled out right from the get-go. And that is, no matter how counterintuitive, in other words, seemingly contrary to common sense, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Really. You know, Christians are often accused of being very dogmatic. You know, it's our way or the highway. Well, I don't know of a more dogmatic statement than this. You know, they cannot prove that there is no God. In order to prove a universal negative, you would have to have universal knowledge. You'd have to essentially have the attributes of deity, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. You'd have to be able to travel through the universe at a flash, check behind every galaxy, and make sure God's not hiding behind some galaxy out there, because if he is, then materialism is a false philosophy. So, ironically, the only way to prove there is no God is if you have the attributes of God. But if you had the attributes of God, God would exist. It would be you, see? So it really is a self-refuting philosophical problem in that regard. So they say we can't allow God, but they can't prove he doesn't exist by the scientific method. So whether they like it or not, God, the God hypothesis, has the right to be at the table whenever the subject of origins is under discussion, whether they jolly well like it or not, unless they can prove scientifically that it's impossible, which they cannot. Therefore, it is an open question, and we do have a right to say there is another way of explaining the facts that we see. Now, when we look at the definition of religion, I love this definition out of the Random House College Dictionary, a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe. You'll notice that fits materialism and evolutionism. It is a belief that rules out the possibility of God right from the get-go, and it's something they can't ultimately prove to be true by the scientific method because science is limited. It cannot give us absolute knowledge, therefore it cannot absolutely rule out the existence of God. Now, they therefore labor under what I call the definition delusion, which is that materialism is defined, I believe illegitimately since they can't ultimately prove it scientifically, as science and as the ultimate scientific truth. God and the supernatural are therefore labeled unscientific and untrue as far as science is concerned because, they can say you can believe in God if you need a crutch, you can believe in God if you want to as, your religious opiate, but real science has nothing to do with that. And yet the classic definition of science is the search for truth, whatever that truth may be. And it just might be true that materialism doesn't work. Natural laws, chemistry, physics, mathematics show that it's beyond reasonable doubt not true. Now, by ruling God out as a possibility, they actually come to the conclusion that even if all the evidence is against them, it still has to be true because there is no other alternative. They've ruled out the God alternative. Therefore, no matter how bad the case is against evolution, it must be true because it's the only show in town. Now, that they cannot legitimately do, but they'll do it if we let them. So I want to emphasize that point for sure tonight. And that leads us, of course, to this conclusion of Carl Sagan, his very famous quote from his Cosmos television series: "The cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be." Really, is that a scientifically provable statement? No. Therefore, it is a statement of philosophy and religion and faith, not a statement of science that can be proven. Now, it gets to the extreme where they actually argue that it doesn't matter if all the evidence supports intelligent design and contradicts naturalistic evolution. For example, Dr. Scott Todd, an immunologist at Kansas State University, said in Nature magazine, which is the most prestigious science journal in the world today, he said, even if all the data, not just some of it, not just the majority of it, but all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. Well, who died and bequeathed to them the right to change the classic definition of science, a search for truth, whatever that truth may be? Not just if it agrees with naturalism, but whether it has evidence and therefore appears to be true. What they're really trying to get away from here is the logical law of the excluded middle. Now, that law states that if there are only two, and only two possibilities to explain any particular phenomenon, if you can disprove one of those possibilities, beyond reasonable doubt, disprove it, then the one that remains is logically the one that must be true. Now, when it comes to our origin, there's really only two basic ways that we can say we got here. Number one, a creator was involved, at least to some extent, in our origin. A creator was necessarily involved, at least to some extent, in our origin. Or number two, a creator was not involved at all. Everything happened without any creator, completely by natural forces, nothing supernatural. Now, does anybody know of a third possibility? Any third or middle possibility? No. So there is no middle possibility or third possibility to appeal to. Therefore, If we can show beyond reasonable doubt, using the laws of chemistry, physics, chemical cross-reaction, mathematics, the fossil record, etc., that beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard that we use in a court of law, you can't prove anything in the absolute sense, perhaps except in mathematics, but to say that the weight of the evidence, the preponderance is so great on one side that we would say beyond a reasonable doubt, this is true and this is false. That happens all the time in a court of law. Somebody could be sentenced to life in prison, not because any eyewitnesses even saw the crime, but because there's such a weight and preponderance of forensic evidence pointing to that person that beyond any reasonable doubt, it's obvious he is guilty. So that's the kind of judgment call we have to make with origins. We weren't there to see the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of man. We can't jump in a time machine and go back in time and observe scientifically what actually did happen. So we have to argue on the basis of available evidence. Now, in this regard, they're saying we have excluded the possibility of a creator and creation because we jolly well say so, not because they can prove it scientifically. And therefore, even if all the data points to a creator, it doesn't matter. Evolution is the only show in town. It's the only eligible option scientifically. Therefore, it has to be true by definition. Now, to put this in terms that we can all understand a little better, every year we have a big football game called the Super Bowl. And it's supposed to prove what team, at least for that season, in the world, what team for that year is the best in the world. So say we have this Super Bowl, and we have two teams show up to play the game. And it turns out to be an historic event. At this Super Bowl, one team dominates the other team like never before in the entire annals of the history of the game of football. One team scores more points than has ever been recorded in any game in the history of the game of football. And not only that, the other team not only does not score a single point, they actually have negative yardage at the end of the game. By every measurable standard, they lost in spades. They lost worse than any team in the history of the game. And yet, at the end of the game, instead of hanging their heads and shuffling off in shame to the showers, they come running triumphantly onto the field, giving themselves high fives, saying, "Hey, give us our Super Bowl ring. We're the champions. We've won again." Well, the crowd begins to boo and hiss. "What's wrong with you people? You're the worst losers in the history of the game. Have you no shame? Get off the field." They say, "Oh, you people in the audience must think that football is all about putting data on the scoreboard in your favor. Points on the scoreboard. We're here to tell you what it's really about. It's about this, the rule book of football." Now, this rule book is a book that we wrote for ourselves when nobody was looking. And they haven't figured that out yet. But we made sure that the first rule we put in the rule book of football is that our team, of all the teams in the world, is the only team eligible to play this game. No other team in the world is eligible to play the game of football. So it doesn't matter how many points they score against us. It doesn't matter how superior they are to us in the art of football. All we have to do is show up. We're eligible. They're not. They lose by default. We win. End of story. Now, that may sound extreme, but that's exactly the game that's being played in science today. They have illegitimately, because of their bias, prejudice, and bigotry against the possibility of God, ruled him unscientific, even though they can't prove scientifically that that is true. Just by bluff and bluster, just by browbeating, just by claiming that they have changed the rules because they say so. Now, if we changed the rules and said, well, only supernatural creation can be considered scientific, we won't even allow any discussion of naturalistic evolution. Oh, they'd scream, they'd howl, they would be, just horrifically offended. But we're supposed to sit here like meek sheep and just take it when they tell us, well, too bad, even if all the evidence is in your favor, you still lose. No. As in football, in science, you either put up or shut up. If you can't put points in the favor of your model, of your theory, of your paradigm, then it's not a good model, and it should be discarded. And if it is a good model, it should be able to stand up to whatever criticism can be brought against it. Instead, they flatly refuse to even have a fair discussion in the media, in the schools, in the textbooks. It's more like victory by censorship rather than by a fair fight. I think they're afraid of a fair fight. If we have a fair fight, they would likely lose. But anyway, that's the problem that we face today. Now, is it therefore science or just a philosophical bias? Well, I quote here D.M.S. Watson, a crusading evolutionist of the early 20th century. He said evolution is a theory universally accepted, not because it can be proved by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. So in other words, evolution is believed not because of evidence, but because if they jolly well know what they don't want to believe. They don't want to believe in creation. So based on what they philosophically disdain, they therefore choose what they want to believe. Well, that's okay under freedom of religion, freedom of belief, but it doesn't make it scientific. It's not a scientific argument. Again, we have Sir Arthur Keith, notable evolutionist from the mid-20th century. He said evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it because the only alternative is special creation, which is unthinkable. Well, really, anybody detect a little bias there? And again, the reason for believing evolution is not because of positive evidence, but because they know jolly well what they don't want to believe, the opposite alternative. Now, L.T. Moore is an evolutionist that really takes the cake. He said, the only alternative to evolution is the doctrine of special creation, which may be true, but is irrational. Now, think that one over real carefully. And our judges don't do much better. Here we have U.S. District Judge John Jones, when striking down the teaching of intelligent design in the public schools, he said, we find that while ID or intelligent design arguments may be true, ID is not science. Well, you've got to ask the question, how can the truth be irrational and unscientific? I mean, this is really bad, because if the truth is irrational and unscientific, we could never argue about anything. Because any argument is determined to use logic and facts to say, this is the truth, this is the reality. The truth is simply that which exists as reality. And if we can't use logic and we can't use evidence, and even if we prove something is true, our opponent can merely say, well, even if it's true, it's irrational and unscientific, then there is no logical discussion that can happen at all. They've cast science and logic to the winds. And this is really a tragic situation, because the Bible tells us when men reject the truth, those who knew God but would not honor him as God, God turns them over to a reprobate mind. And their foolish hearts are darkened, and they profess to be wise, but they become fools. I would say, unfortunately, this is a very foolish statement, that even if it's true, it's irrational. No, if it's true, it's the truth, and that's not irrational. This statement is irrational. That's the truth. Okay. Now, let's look at the Big Bang. The Handy Space Answer book, which I have on my bookshelf, says 15 to 20 billion years ago, a Big Bang or explosion occurred, creating the universe. The universe began as an infinitely dense, hot fireball, a scrambling of space and time. Okay, well, all of the calculations, however, start with the cosmic egg. This cosmic egg is supposed to have had all the matter and energy of the universe, all the galaxies, all the stars, planets, all the black holes compressed into a tiny little singularity or cosmic egg, smaller than an atom that you couldn't even see without an electron microscope, or even maybe not even then. But it's there. It may be ultra compact, but it's all there. So they don't start with nothing. They start with the cosmic egg. That's where the calculations start. It explodes and inflates, and billions of years later, here are you and I supposedly thinking about it. Now the problem is, where did that cosmic egg come from? Okay, it's ultimately the mother of all black holes, literally, because all black holes came from it when it explosively inflated. So where did it come from? Well, Stephen Hawking has even proven that black holes still obey the second law of thermodynamics. They leak what's called Hawking radiation, in honor of him having proved that, and therefore they dissipate their free energy over time. They can't last eternally, and neither could the mother of all black holes, apparently. So, because the second law of thermodynamics states that with time, usable energy, called free energy, degrades into an unusable form of energy that's very dilute and dissipated, called entropy, that the universe is therefore irreversibly running down toward maximum entropy, where eventually there will be no free energy at all. Everything will be dark and cold, no temperature differential, absolute zero, and that would be the heat death of the universe. Now, the universe has still got a lot of free energy in it. So the question is, since it's running down, who put the free energy there to begin with? It can't maintain itself eternally, so the universe free energy can't be there eternally. It had to have a beginning. But the first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. at least not by natural law. So the second law says it could not be eternal. The first law says it cannot create itself. Therefore, whether they like it or not, we need something transcendent to the physical universe, something transcendent to the laws of this physical universe. The thing they're trying to avoid, the G word, God. Okay, we need a transcendent creator, because by terms of its own laws, the universe could not be eternal, but it could not have created itself, and yet here it is. Something beyond physics, chemistry, natural law had to be there to do that. Now, even Stephen Hawking agrees that in real time, the universe has a beginning. He also said almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning. This is something Einstein showed us, that space, matter, and time are inextricably intertwined. You can't have one without the other. Therefore, since the universe had a beginning, time itself must have had a beginning. And thanks to Einstein's equations and the laws of thermodynamics, almost all scientists today agree that the universe did have a beginning, which is quite a change in viewpoint, because outside of Judeo-Christendom, for many thousands of years, everybody else believed that there was eternal matter, perhaps in a chaotic state to begin with, but the universe was eternal, and that it evolved gods or whatever, and the gods created people, or however they want to look at it, but always started with matter being eternal. But now they say the universe did have a beginning. It wasn't eternal, something that agrees with what God's word has said for thousands of years. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So that means that the whole universe falls under the primary law of all science, the law of cause and effect, which states that for every effect there must be an adequate cause, and no effect can be greater than its cause. This is the most axiomatic and basic law in all of science. If this were not true, there is no known exception to it, but if it were not true, we could not even run the scientific method. Because after all, if things could come into existence, effects could happen without a cause, how could you ever run an experiment and know whether your results are correct? Because maybe you run it tomorrow, it'll be different because something changed from nothing. Some effect came out of nothing and changed everything. You see, if this is not true, science is not even possible. So it's not something we could just throw away because we don't like it. The law of cause and effect is axiomatic, the most foundational law of all science, period. Now, the law of cause and effect is so obvious that even children understand it. I mean, if, for example, I say, there's a big bulldozer out here in the parking lot. It wasn't there yesterday. How did it get there? And somebody says, well, you see that ant out there, that little ant on the sidewalk? Last night, that ant pulled that bulldozer over here from across the street. Well, even a child would say, wait a minute, that ant doesn't have enough power to do that. That's an inadequate cause. It can't be a right explanation based on the law of cause and effect. Now, if we said that the bulldozer was put on a trailer and pulled by a big diesel truck, that would be an adequate cause. Or if we said the bulldozer moved the ant over here, well, it would be overkill, but it wouldn't violate the law of cause and effect, would it? So another way of putting the law of cause and effect is that you can't give more than what you have. You can't do more than what you're capable of doing because you have to have the attributes to do it. So the law of cause and effect, for every effect there must be an adequate cause, not just any cause, but an adequate cause, and no effect can be greater than its cause. Now then, Sir Francis Bacon, who was largely credited with establishing the modern scientific method, he said true knowledge is knowledge by causes. Using the experimental method to find out how the laws of chemistry and physics work, what is causing things to happen. That's the basis of real science. Even David Hume, the very famous skeptic and materialist, he said, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that something could arise without a cause. He did not want to be accused of violating the law of cause and effect with his philosophy. But you see, he lived before the 20th century, when, thanks to Einstein and our understanding of the laws of thermodynamics, the majority of scientists have come to accept the universe did in fact have a beginning. So he thought the universe was always there, it could have evolved everything else, and therefore I'm not going to believe that something could come from nothing. Well, he has been outdone by his modern contemporary evolutionists today, as we shall see. Now, using the law of cause and effect, we can do a logical syllogistic reasoning from a true premise down to a valid conclusion. Now, we start with the premise, everything that had a beginning requires a cause to explain its origin. Is that a valid premise? Yes, because basically restating the law of cause and effect, which is a valid law. Therefore, the universe, including time itself, can be shown to have had a beginning, as Stephen Hawking and Einstein would agree. Secondly, it is unreasonable to believe something could begin to exist without a cause. And the conclusion, the universe, therefore, requires a cause, not just any cause, a cause adequate to explain its power, its incredible fine-tuning, the things in it like living creatures and man himself with all of his amazing attributes of intellect, emotions, free will, abstract thought, just tremendous attributes that we have. What would be the adequate cause to explain this universe and everything in it? Well, at this point, of course, the evolutionists are getting a little nervous. We're using science and the scientific laws, like the law of cause and effect, to kind of back them in a corner and show, hey, if the universe had a beginning, it requires an adequate cause. Do you have an adequate cause? We do. We have an omniscient, omnipotent creator that we believe in, which would explain all of us very easily. At this point, evolutionists like Richard Dawkins try to turn the tables, and they say, well, it's very easy to deal with this. I'll just ask these questions. Who made the maker? Who created the creator? Who made God? And he thinks he's being very profound in saying that, but actually, he is guilty of asking an illogical question. Okay? His question is akin to this question. To whom is the bachelor married? Is there a problem with that question? Yes, because by definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man. So to ask, to whom is the unmarried man married, is an illogical, self-contradictory question. Likewise, God, by definition, is the I am, the very essence of existence, the eternal, self-existent one. That's what Yahweh means in the Hebrew. So God claims to be a being outside of space and time and natural law. He transcends all of our limitations. We can't put him in a box and put him under our limitations and say he's got to be like us. He says he isn't. In Isaiah, he says, as high as the heavens are above the earth, are my thoughts above your thoughts, and my ways, including the ways of his infinite and eternal existence, my ways are above your ways by an unfathomable degree that you cannot comprehend with your finite minds. But that doesn't mean he's not real just because we can't understand everything about him. We understand enough. Does everybody understand everything about the earth? Well, you can't walk on it, you can't have a relationship with it unless you understand everything about it. No, we understand enough. You understand everything about how your brain works? Well, I guess you can't use your brain unless you do. Can't use your cell phone unless you understand how it works, or your car. You see, to require that we understand everything about God in order to believe in him is absurd and hypocritical, because all of our life we have working relationships with people and things and ourselves that we don't fully understand everything, but we don't need to. We understand enough. So God says, you can't fully understand me, but I am the best explanation. He did show up in space and time in the person of Jesus Christ and split history in two, fulfilling prophecy, doing miracles that confirmed his deity, one of the most profound ones being raising Lazarus from the dead. I mean, this guy had been dead for 4 days, stinking, rotting, putrefying. He wasn't just passed out in a coma. When you're stinky dead, you're really dead. And they said, Lord, by now he stinketh. Don't roll back the stone, he'll stink. And Jesus, in essence, said, I am the same God who took a lump of dust in Genesis and made a living man, Adam, out of it. Now, Lazarus, the stinking one, is rotting, putrefying, corrupting back into dust, but he's not so far gone as Adam was when I started with him. If I can take a lump of dust and make it a man, I can take this rotting, stinking, putrefying corpse and make it a living human being again. Because I am the resurrection and the life. I am the master of human biological architecture. And those trillions of cells all had to be put back perfectly. The blood had to, be made pure. And the heart, everything had to be perfect. And yet by the power of his spoken word, it all immediately was fixed. You got to be God to pull that off. That's why it says many believed on him because of that. Well, he not only did that, he raised himself from the dead. One of the best established facts of history, as I point out in one of my DVDs back there. So the point is, the universe requires a cause. God is that adequate cause. And there is no law of science or logic that says something cannot be infinite and eternal, because God exists outside of time and outside of these limitations. So God, as creator of time, is outside of time. Since, therefore, he has no beginning in time, he has always existed, so doesn't need a cause. So, There's no law of science or logic that says something that's transcendent, that transcends all the limitations of space-time and natural law as we know it, could not be infinite and eternal, because he's not running afoul of the primary law of science, the law of cause and effect, which, by the way, doesn't have jurisdiction over everything. It only has jurisdiction over things that have a beginning. Guess what? God had no beginning in time. He transcended time itself. Therefore, God is simply not under the jurisdiction of the law of cause and effect. He is infinite and eternal. Now, the universe, however, is under the law of cause and effect because, as they agree, it did have a beginning. So there must be an adequate cause to explain it. Well, using the law of cause and effect, we can do something that was done by a great philosopher thousands of years ago, Aristotle, arguing against the evolutionists of his day. You know, evolution is not a new idea. It's thousands of years old. Darwin kind of revamped it somewhat in more modern times and tried to polish it up and make it a little more acceptable. But the idea has been around philosophically probably from time immemorial. And Aristotle had to wrestle with evolutionists in his day. But he used the law of cause and effect, the most axiomatic law in all of science and logic, to refute their claims. He argued there must be an eternal uncaused cause, something that transcended time itself, because they also argued philosophically that time did have to have a beginning, that something had to exist before that, timeless and eternal, to even bring time into existence. So, using the law of cause and effect, he argued that the first cause, and we would argue today a little bit differently, but same general principle, the first cause of endless time must be eternal, something not limited by time, something capable of creating time, therefore transcends time itself and would be eternal. The first cause of boundless energy must be omnipotent or all-powerful. The first cause of universal interrelationships must be omnipresent or everywhere present. The first cause of supreme complexity must be omniscient or all-knowing. The first cause of moral values must be moral. The first cause of spiritual values must be spiritual. The first cause of human responsibility must be volitional or have free will. The first cause of human integrity must be truthful. The first cause of human love must be loving. And the first cause of life must be living. Of course, we can include other things in there, like the first cause of consciousness must itself be conscious. You know, that question was asked by Ken Ham to Bill Nye in the Ken Ham-Bill Nye debate. Well, he said, I don't know where consciousness came from. Well, here's a good first cause explanation for it. We would say that the first cause of the universe and everything in it must have this nature. It must be living, loving, truthful, volitional, spiritual, moral, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, and eternal. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah. It just so happens to be the attributes of the God who has revealed himself in the Bible, and most expressly in these last days, in the person of Jesus Christ, the Son of God and Creator. Notice I didn't quote any scripture to come to this conclusion. I used the primary law of all science, the law of cause and effect. Now, believe it or not, nothing is the preferred cause of all things to many who so disdain the possibility of God at all, and I'm not kidding. For example, Alan Guth and his associate Paul Steinhardt. Alan Guth is internationally famous. Now, he said it is tempting to go one step further and speculate that the entire universe evolved from literally nothing. Why is it so tempting that everything should come from nothing? Well, if everything did come from nothing, then we're not accountable to nothing. We don't have to submit to nothing. We ultimately, as far as we know, are the highest evolved intelligent creatures in the universe. Therefore, we're the top dogs. We can do what we want, make up our own morality, be our own gods. But if there is a God who has so powerfully created this universe and us, then he has the right to be the moral governor and judge of the universe, to judge us for every thought, word, and deed of our lives. That's a frightening thought. But the good news is our God loves us enough to die for us, and therefore he is not to be feared. He would rather die than see us rejected. And his love is there for everyone. Jesus died not only for our sins, but for the sins of the whole world. So it is tempting if you want to be your own God and do your own thing and not be accountable. But it's certainly not tempting from a scientific perspective, because there's no greater violation of the primary law of science, the law of cause and effect, than to say everything came from nothing, which is literally that which does not exist. How can the lack of existence cause anything since there's nothing there to do any causing? You know, I like Aristotle's definition of nothing. He said, nothing is what rocks dream about. Nothing, yes. Well, and it can't do nothing either. Okay. Now, Edward Tryon, notable evolutionist scientist, he said that our universe had its physical origin as a quantum fluctuation of some pre-existing true vacuum or state of nothingness. Well, that almost sounds eloquent if it weren't so absurd. I mean, even a child realizes that nothing is no thing. It's something that does not exist. Therefore, it's not a thing at all. It's nothing. And if there's nothing there to do anything or cause anything, then you can't get anything. From nothing comes nothing. Now, Paul Davies, very notable evolutionist scientist, he said this quantum cosmology provides a loophole for the universe to, so to speak, spring into existence from nothing without violating any laws of physics. Not so quick. It does violate the first law of thermodynamics that says matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed by natural forces. It certainly violates the law of common sense, which a lot of people ought to obey, but they don't. And it definitely contradicts the scientific law of cause and effect. Now, what's he getting at here with this quantum cosmology? At the quantum level or subatomic level, they observe that we can see things like a subatomic particle, like a proton seems to appear out of nothing, and then it may disappear, and then it may reappear, and then it may disappear, like it's coming in and out of existence. And the idea is, well, if that can happen at the quantum level, it could happen at the macroscopic level. Not necessarily true. Furthermore, they have not proven it's coming from nothing. They would have to prove that there's no energy there for that subatomic particle to coalesce from. Because thanks to Einstein equals mc squared, we know that matter is a form of energy. It's all energy, okay? So matter can be transformed into energy. Energy can coalesce into matter. They're both forms of energy. So if there's any energy there, that could be how these subatomic particles are coalescing from it and then dissipating back into energy. That's fully in accord with physics as we know it, and it certainly hasn't proven that something can come from nothing, since energy is certainly something and not nothing. They would have to prove that, and they'd have to prove that it applies at the macroscopic level, which, how in the world would they prove that? This basically is clutching at straws, and even Paul Davies said, well, you shouldn't take these speculations too seriously. Good advice. I wouldn't either. Okay. But it shows how desperate they are, in my opinion. Now, Richard Dawkins, always a good fellow to quote, he said, the fact that life evolved out of nearly nothing some 10 billion years after the universe evolved literally out of nothing is a fact so staggering that I would be mad to attempt words to do it justice. Well, Dr. Dawkins, please indulge in some madness. I would love to hear your explanation. I don't like this escape clause that, I couldn't do it justice. No, try. Try to explain how scientifically the whole of reality came from that which never existed, and explain what scientific laws and facts support that, please, or where it has ever been observed. There is no evidence for it. It's all bluff and bluster. Now, even Stephen Hawking, as brilliant a scientist as he is, has bought into this idea. He said the laws of evolution can also determine the initial state. The universe can spontaneously create itself out of nothing. Wow. Well, a child could refute that. Nothing can create itself because before it existed, there was nothing there to do any creating. I mean, is that illogical? Well, he does apparently have some scientific reasoning, supposedly, for this. He said, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. Now, I guess it's good to appeal to a law of science if you want to say something scientific. But why would he appeal to the law of gravity? I mean, we understand gravity. It warps the fabric of space-time. It causes objects with mass to attract one another. But what does that have to do with something coming out of nothing? I don't know. It seems odd to me. And for such a brilliant man to make an argument like this really makes me wonder what's happened. he does have ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which affects the body. It's not supposed to affect the mind. And so another question we could ask is, the law of gravity is something. Where did it come from? Where do laws come from? Laws come from a lawgiver or a legislator, but since they believe in no divine lawgiver or legislator, wherefrom come the laws that govern the universe? And if a law is there, then it is something. How does this law cause something to come from nothing? Especially when all it does is affect matter that already exists and how it interacts with each other. I don't know. Maybe you could tell me. I haven't figured that out. Okay. I think the real reason he's honest about, if we get down to it, and that's this. He says, there have been various ideas, but for me, the most attractive is that the universe was spontaneously created out of absolutely nothing. That's a little more honest. Don't say gravity means something can come from nothing. That's absurd on the face of it. This is a little more honest. You don't want to believe it. It's not attractive. What is attractive is that everything came from nothing. Okay, a religious philosophy. Fine. Freedom of religion. I'm all for that. Long as you have truth in advertising and admit that really is where it's coming from and not trying to say, because there's a law like gravity, things can come from absolutely nothing. Now, notice what he says here. There's a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Wait 1 minute. This guy just said everything came from nothing, based on his authority as a famous scientist, and really nothing more. Because I'd like to know just what observation and reason he can point to that tells us that everything came from nothing. Got an experiment to prove that? No. Have we ever observed it in the history of science? No. Does it violate known science? Yes, the first law of thermodynamics and the law of cause and effect. Not to mention the law of common sense, which I think is one of the most important laws, if we can call it a law. But, this kind of reminds me of what the communists always do. They accuse their opponents of exactly the thing that they are guilty of to try to take the attention away from them. They falsely accuse somebody else. Well, yes, we may have a religion. We may believe in an omniscient, omnipotent, eternal creator God, but you know what? Based on observation and reason, that appears to be the most adequate cause to explain it, both scientifically and historically. Now, he also said, they made God a human-like being with whom one can have a personal relationship. It was more like God actually made us in his image so we could have a personal relationship with him. But he says, when you look at the vast size of the universe and how insignificant and accidental human life is in it, that seems most impossible. Wait a minute. In a court of law, we would say that our opponent is assuming facts that have not been proven in evidence. In other words, assuming something as fact that has not been proven as a fact and cannot be presented as evidence in the court. How does he know that human life is accidental? Did he observe it accidentally occur? No. What do the laws of mathematics, chemistry, physics, etc. have to say about that? It seems impossible that any living form, much less man, the most complex form, could have happened by accident. So, assuming facts not in evidence, and saying that we're insignificant because of the size of the universe. Really? Well, God who created the universe says in Psalm 19:1 that the heavens are there for us. This huge universe with all its power and wisdom that we see displayed in it, with all its complexity and fine-tuning, is there to declare to us his glory, because nothing on earth would be big enough, powerful enough, awesome enough, majestic enough to convey to us his glory. Therefore, although we're small, we must be important, because this whole big universe exists for our benefit, to minister to us, to teach us something about God. Not only that, the God that created this huge universe humbled himself, became a man, died in our place. That makes us infinitely valuable, because the infinite ransom price was paid for us. So I'd rather believe what God says than what Stephen Hawking says for a number of reasons, but he can't prove that we're here accidentally, and he claims we're insignificant when God says we are the most significant creatures in the universe, the very purpose for which the huge universe exists, and he who created us died for us, giving us infinite value. Now, some might say, well, these are some older quotes, and they don't believe this anymore, that everything came from nothing. Oh, yeah? New Scientist magazine, notice the date, 2011, says, why does the universe exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? Perhaps the Big Bang was just nothingness doing what comes naturally. Yeah, it is rather laughable, and perhaps they think by saying this as if it were a joke or in a trite way, we'll overlook the fact that it is absurd on the face of it. It is absurd. You know, see this ear? This ear is not a trash can. Please don't stick your absurd nonsense into my ear and tell me it's scientific when you can't prove it. If you could prove it, that would be one thing. Otherwise, it's just your religion. Thank you, I have my own religious beliefs. I don't need the God of nothing. I prefer the God of everything. And I think he's a God more worthy of worship, to say the least. Now, Paul Davies, in his book, The Edge of Infinity, he wrote, in relation to the Big Bang, that the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. Well, I'll grant you that. That would be quite a miracle. But the question I would like to ask is, why is this more scientific than in the beginning God created, Genesis 1:1? It is not more scientific. Genesis 1:1 is in full accord with the primary law of all science, the law of cause and effect. If you want a miracle, what's an adequate cause? A miracle-working God. I'll tell you what is a violation of the law of cause and effect: this miracle of everything coming from nothing without an adequate cause, namely a miracle worker. Now, I can believe, that a magician can pull off the illusion of pulling a rabbit out of his hat. But these fellows have pulled the whole universe out of their hat, and they don't even have a hat. That's a little hard to buy, and it just doesn't wash. Now, another interesting thing, here we have experts contradicting one another. Remember, Stephen Hawking said, because there is a law, like gravity, everything can come from nothing, which doesn't really make sense, but he says, well, there's a law. Okay, well, here he says, no, we need to get rid of the laws. We have to have lawlessness, because the law of cause and effect says it can't happen. The first law of thermodynamics says it can't happen. So they're contradicting one another. And I like to ask, where do laws come from at all? From a lawgiver and sustainer, an almighty creator, a legislator who creates and sustains the laws, and they don't come from nothing. And how can lawlessness be an adequate cause for the laws that we now have? If it all came from lawlessness, why do we now have laws? Isn't that, again, an inadequate cause for what we see in the universe? Again, contradiction upon contradiction. It is a conundrum indeed. Now, other problems with the Big Bang: no antimatter. Michio Kaku, he said, what happened to our evil twin, antimatter? Antimatter basically has the same components as matter. In matter, you have protons, electrons, and neutrons. The protons are positively charged, electrons are negatively charged. It's reversed, though, in antimatter. The protons would be negatively charged, or antiprotons, and the electrons would be positrons instead of electrons. You may recall that in Star Trek: The Next Generation, Data, the android, had a positronic brain instead of an electronic brain. That doesn't really count for anything, just a little trivia. But the point is that, they have to assume that there was just a little bit extra matter, and so it annihilated all the antimatter. There isn't any antimatter to be found anywhere that didn't somehow contact, the matter and get annihilated, and the gamma radiation and everything. But Michio Kaku said, the calculations seem to show there should be equal amounts, but it must have somehow got annihilated because it's not there. Almost a kind of a circular argument. No heavy elements and no population 3 stars. Now, the population 3 stars are supposed to be the first stars that formed from the Big Bang, having primarily hydrogen and helium and maybe traces of lithium and deuterium. That's it. They should still be around, but we can't find one. They've looked all over. If somebody could find one, they'd get a Nobel Prize. But here again, the theory predicts things that we don't see. And so to cover it up, they say, well, they must have all burned out, even though theoretically they should not have burned out yet, because they aren't there. Maybe they aren't there because the theory is wrong, but that's never allowed to be asked. Is the theory wrong? No, that's not allowed. Materialism has to explain everything, so we got to have our materialistic theory. Well, we don't find the population 3 stars that should be there. Furthermore, how do we get heavy elements? We do not get them from a Big Bang. All the calculations show you get mainly hydrogen, which has 1 proton, helium, which has 2, lithium, which has 3. That's it. Nothing above 3-proton lithium, and you only get traces of that. Well, all life forms have to have carbon, which has 6 protons. Nitrogen has 7, oxygen has 8. You get up to, say, iron, you got iron in your blood, 26 protons. Where did these heavier elements come from if the Big Bang can only produce, nothing more than 3-proton lithium and not much of that, mainly hydrogen and helium? Well, the answer is you have to believe that the Big Bang has exploded this gas condensed by gravitation into stars, and in the thermonuclear furnace of the stars, the great heat and pressure fused protons together to get heavier elements up to iron. Then the shocking power of a supernova explosion provided the final energy to synthesize the heaviest natural elements, including uranium-238, the heaviest naturally occurring element. So when that supernova exploded, the gas and dust had those heavier elements in it. Then they recondensed into stars and planets that now have those heavy elements that we have in our bodies, heavier elements at least than hydrogen, helium, and lithium, and therefore life could evolve then. So there's a big problem here. They have to have a rock-solid proof that gas will spontaneously, by known physics, condense to form stars, because if they can't get the first stars formed from the Big Bang, neither can they explain the origin of the heavy elements that are in your body and mine, or heavier elements than hydrogen and helium especially. So their idea is that gas clouds spontaneously collapse upon themselves to form stars by gravitational contraction. Now here we have images taken by the European Southern Observatory, a very large telescope, in January 2002 of the Horsehead Nebula in Orion, and it verified that the structures are actually expanding. Well, guess what? See all that light, all that color there? It's because hot gas, very elementary physics, hot gas expands. It does not contract. And that's perhaps the single greatest physical problem with the origin of stars from gas. If you have a gas cloud, which is very dilute, it might be a few light years across, to condense into a star, if it does begin to condense, there's hardly any gravitational attraction amongst the atoms in that gas cloud anyway. But if by some miracle it did start contracting by gravitational force, compressed gas heats. And that heat energy excites the atoms and pushes them out with a force 50 to 100 times greater than the minute gravitational force. It's kind of like having a tug-of-war where you have at least 50 men on one side of the rope and 1 man on the other. Simple physics says it's going to go in the direction of greater force. So there is a big problem here based on known physics as to why these things would form. You have to have already a lot of density there with enough gravity to make it contract, but you don't have that in a gas cloud. So when they look for places where they claim that it's happening, when we examine it more closely, we find out exactly the opposite is happening. It is expanding. Now, Philip Seddon, notable evolutionist, he says, the standard Big Bang model does not give rise to lumpiness. That model assumes the universe started out as a globally smooth, homogeneous, expanding gas. If you apply the laws of physics to this model, you get a universe that is uniform, a cosmic vastness of evenly distributed atoms with no organization of any kind. No stars, no planets, no galaxies, nothing but ever more expanding, more dilute gas atoms. That's exactly what Sir Fred Hoyle also said. A dull as ditchwater expansion. The idea that stars and galaxies would form from that is an illusion. It would just get more and more dilute. Nothing would form by way of stars, planets, or galaxies, based on known physics anyway. Now, here we have the popular theory is that stars form from vast clouds of gas and dust through gravitational contraction. But as we've seen, the contraction would produce much greater heat pressure, greatly exceeding the gravitational pressure. It would just push back out. Now, since gas and dust clouds will not contract because of that reason, they've had to say we need an outside force to compress that gas to where it would get dense enough to hold on to itself by its own gravity. Now remember, they've already said no divine foot in the door. So what can this outside source be? It has to be something naturalistic. And the best idea they could come up with is that a nearby star exploded in a supernova. Okay, so you have your gas cloud here, and the star here explodes, and the gas pressure from that explosion condenses that gas cloud and makes it form a star. Now there's a dandy explanation of where stars came from. In order to get a star, you must first have a star that can explode to produce a star. Where in the world did the first generation stars come from if it takes a star to get a star? I mean, a child would ask that question. And yet, the National Academy of Sciences seems to think that's good enough. Here we have star nurseries. Now, here's the idea that, well, we don't see it, and based on known physics, it can't happen. But maybe the laws of physics are tweaked a little bit differently out in deeper space. And maybe out there it can happen, and then maybe things just kind of drifted into our part of space. Now, here we have the pillars of creation, they're called, in the famous Eagle Nebula. And these are supposed to be star-forming nurseries. Now, you notice the stars in there are already stars. We need to see a gas cloud that condenses and forms a star where there was no star before. Now, how many of you expect you could see something like that? It would be like saying Niagara Falls is going to run uphill spontaneously because we want it to. Well, it's never been observed to do that. It violates physics. But it's worse than that. Their own theory says it would take perhaps hundreds of thousands to millions of years for a gas cloud to condense into a star. Who is going to live long enough to watch it happen? So it's not even a testable theory by the scientific observational method. Okay, notice they say stars are still forming today, a statement of faith, not a fact. About 1,500 light years away lies the Orion Nebula. Enough gas and dust to make millions of stars. Just because enough gas and dust doesn't mean it's going to happen. It even contains protostars that are still condensing. Okay? Stating it as a fact doesn't make it a fact. Where's the observation? Where's the physics to prove it? It's just not there. Now, Ron Cohen, in his article, Rethinking an Astronomical Icon, The Eagle's Egg Not So Fertile, he said, NASA's claim in 1995 that these pictures showed hundreds to thousands of stars forming was based on the speculative egg star formation theory. It has recently been tested independently with 2 infrared detectors that can see inside the dusty pillars. Now, that's real science. Do some independent investigation. And what did they find? Well, they found few stars were there, and 85% of the pillars had too little dust and gas to support star formation. Quote, the new findings also highlight how much astronomers still have to learn about star formation. Oh, a little humble, humility. We don't actually know everything, and we don't really see it, and it does violate known physics. So, these are not star nurseries after all. Therefore, how do we explain how stars got there? A nearby star exploded in supernova and compressed the gas into a star. Again, the National Academy of Sciences endorses that idea. Here, in their slick little publication they sent out to many school districts called Science and Creationism, a view from the National Academy of Sciences, they say astrophysicists have developed plausible means reasonable, hypotheses concerning the formation of galaxies, individual stars, and planetary systems. The sun and planets in our solar system are believed to have been formed by condensations from an interstellar cloud of dust and gas, like those now visible in parts of our galaxy. The condensation resulting in our solar system was initiated by a nearby exploding star or supernova. There we have it. Our star and our solar system exist because a nearby star was there existing to explode. But where did it come from? You see, it really answers nothing about the origin of first-generation stars. Now, Leda and Shu, a couple of evolutionist astronomers at this International Astronomy Union Symposium, they publish these things in these, boring proceedings of these symposiums. It doesn't really get into the textbooks where we really need it, or in the media where people really need to hear it. But you notice they admit, most disturbing, however, is the fact that despite numerous efforts, we have yet to directly observe the process of stellar formation. Well, geez, and it's supposed to take hundreds of thousands of years, maybe that's a good reason. They said, we have not yet been able to unambiguously detect the collapse of a molecular cloud core or the infall of circumstellar material onto an embryonic star. Until such an observation is made, it would probably be prudent to regard our current hypotheses and theoretical scenarios with some degree of suspicion. Yeah. If it sounds too good to be true, violates natural law, cannot be scientifically confirmed by real observation, yeah, maybe it does deserve a high degree of suspicion. Now, Martin Harwitt, writing in Science magazine, he is a notable evolutionist cosmologist, he says, the universe we see, when we look out at its furthest horizons, contains 100 billion galaxies. Each of these galaxies contains another 100 billion stars. That's 10 to the 22nd power stars all told. The silent embarrassment of modern astrophysics is that we do not know how even a single one of those stars managed to form. See, silent embarrassment in that they're not wanting to talk about it. You do good admissions here and there in some of the technical literature, but it doesn't seem to filter down into the textbooks and the media where the common person can really lay a hold of it. Now, the conclusion on star formation by Abraham Loeb of the Harvard Center for Astrophysics, he said, the truth is that we don't understand star formation at a fundamental level. Well, please tell the History Channel, Discovery Channel, Science Channel, they haven't figured that out yet. They just say it's a fact, it happened, that's that. Well, this is the truth. They don't understand it, it defies known physics, and it has never been truly observed scientifically. Joseph Silk, professor of astronomy at the University of Oxford, in his book, The Big Bang, he said, many aspects of the evolution of galaxies cannot yet be determined with any certainty. Well, then please stop calling it a fact all the time. James Strafil, notable evolutionist, in his book, The Dark Side of the Universe, he said, the problem of explaining the existence of galaxies has proved to be one of the thorniest in cosmology. By all rights, they just shouldn't be there, yet there they sit. It's hard to convey the depth of frustration that this simple fact induces among scientists. Yeah, the truth be known, it's very frustrating to have a theory that's supposed to explain everything without God, but it can't even explain the existence of the most prominent things we see in the night sky. The stars, the planets, the galaxies. Yeah, that would be frustrating indeed. Okay, Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize-winning physicist. In fact, some actually rank him higher than Stephen Hawking, believe it or not. So he is a first-rank, first-class scientist in this regard. He is a committed atheist, though, so he does have his philosophical bias. But he says, there are plenty of mysteries left, many of them discussed by other authors in this issue, speaking of an issue of Scientific American magazine. Of what kind of matter are galaxies and galactic clusters made? How did the stars, planets, and galaxies form? Well, if this Nobel laureate hasn't figured it out yet, guess what? Nobody has, not really. Stephen Hawking, again, in his very famous book, A Brief History of Time, notice the 10th edition. By the time he gets to the 10th edition, he's had time to figure this, think it over, and know that he actually wants to say this. But he said this Big Bang picture of the universe is in agreement with all the observational evidence that we have today. Now, he's mainly talking there about the fact that we have observed the universe is expanding. Who first recorded that truth? Not Edwin Hubble in the early 20th century, when we discovered it by scientific means. It was recorded 17 times in the Old Testament, thousands of years ago. Somebody gave us knowledge of this that we could not possibly have known until we had 20th century technology. God says he is stretching the heavens out as a scroll and spreading them out as a tent to dwell in. Now, notice that Stephen Hawking admits, nevertheless, it leaves a number of important questions unanswered, including that old bugaboo, the origin of stars and galaxies. Wow. You'd never know that watching the History Channel, Science Channel, Discovery Channel. They just say it's a fact, it happened. Well, they have to say it because they exist, and they know that they could not have been created because a creator is ruled out by definition, by decree. But when it comes down to the science and the observation to prove it, it's just not there. Okay. Now, for those who think, well, these are kind of old quotes, they figured it out now. Notice Nature magazine, most prestigious science journal in the world, 2011, just a few years ago, it says, galaxies are complicated and we don't really understand how they form. It's really an embarrassment. Yeah, well, they ought to be very embarrassed that they keep saying it's a fact, it's true, it's science, when to this day in the 21st century, they really don't understand it because it defies known physics and it has not really ever been observed scientifically. So, Mr. Big Bang says, I can explain the origin of the universe, no problem. It's just the origin of the stars and galaxies I'm having trouble with. Yeah, just the most prominent things you see in the night sky. Now we're going to look at another big problem for the Big Bang, and that is the extreme fine-tuning of the universe. This appears to require a fine-tuner, a creator of tremendous power to pull this off. Not something you'd expect to happen from an explosion or expansion of matter. Now here we have a standard ruler. A standard ruler has 12 inches. What if we were to expand the number of inches on this ruler so it became so long that it had enough inches to go from one end of the known universe to the other? Anybody know how many inches that would be? Well, they estimate it would be about 10 to the power of 31, the number 1 with 31 zeros after it. That happens to be 10 quadrillion quadrillion. Okay? So if we took this ruler and we extended it until it had 10 quadrillion quadrillion inches, then we say here at inch 6 is the universal setting for gravity on a cosmic scale, and we want to increase that by just 1 inch from 6 to 7. Okay? Now that's only changed it by 1 10 quadrillion quadrillionth. It shouldn't make any difference at all. But it does. You and I disappear. We cannot exist anywhere in that new universe because gravity has been changed by 1 10 quadrillion quadrillionth. Nothing bigger than the size of a pea biologically could exist in that new universe. Big-bodied, big-brained creatures like us simply could not exist. So everything appears to be very fine-tuned to an infinitesimal degree, and even the slightest change, and all of a sudden, we could not exist anywhere in the universe. In fact, it looks like the universe was custom fine-tuned with us in mind, so that we would be able to actually exist in this universe. Another example is the strong nuclear force. Now, the protons in the nucleus of the atom are all positively charged. Okay, of course, magnetic theory says that charges of the same polarity repel. Okay, so like they're all positive charged, like you take magnets, the two positive sides, they'll repel one another. Opposites attract. But you have all these positively charged protons, they should be repelling one another, according to magnetic theory, yet there's a force holding them in there, the strong nuclear force, or atomic glue, whatever they want to call it. I think it's Christ, because it says in Colossians that he upholds all things by his power. In him all things consist or hold together. There is a force holding matter together, but I don't think it's just some unnamed force. I think there's a God who made these laws. These laws are sustained miracles. They're laws put there by a lawgiver who sustains his own laws. That makes perfect sense, perfectly in accordance with the law of cause and effect. But what if we were to change the force of that strong nuclear force? What if we were to change it by a factor of only 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, number 1 of 40 zeros? So we're changing it by 1 part in, let's see, what would that be? 10,000 quintillion quintillion. We've changed it by 1 10,000 quintillion quintillionth. Shouldn't make any difference at all. But it does. You and I disappear. All matter disappears. All things disappear except for single proton hydrogen. That's all that could exist. Wow. You just change it by the tiniest infinitesimal degree and everything in the universe changes. And this is just a couple examples of many, many things in this regard. Steven Weinberg, again, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he admits, thus the existence of life of any kind seems to require a cancellation between different contributions to the vacuum energy. Now, that's the energy required in the expansion of the universe. The universe has to expand in incredibly precise parameters. If it's slightly too fast or slightly too slow or just slightly off, life could not exist anywhere in this universe. I don't think a random explosion can be that precise. Of course, being a committed atheist, he has to believe that, but he notices what the odds, he says, of this happening. He says it seems to require cancellation between different contributions to the vacuum energy or that expansion energy, accurate to about 120 decimal places. Number 1 with 120 zeros after it. Now you can compare that to 10 to the power of 80. That's the approximate number of protons, electrons, and neutrons in the entire observable universe. This number is 40 orders of magnitude greater than that, meaning it's 10,000 quintillion quintillion times greater than the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons in the entire universe. So those are the odds. Utterly impossible based on the single law of chance, or the Borelian law of chance, which states that on the cosmic scale, any chance event less than 1 chance in 10 to the 50th power, you can write it off. It won't happen anywhere in space and time, not even in 20 billion years. But he says that those are the odds. He said it is possible that this cancellation will be explained in terms of some future theory. In other words, current theories can't explain that level of fine-tuning. So far, in string theory as well as in quantum field theory, the vacuum energy involves arbitrary constants which must be carefully adjusted. By what? By chance? No, by an intelligent, powerful fine-tuner, that would make sense, to make the total vacuum energy small enough for life to be possible. Now, astronomer H. Ross has calculated the probability that these and other constants of physics, 122 different ones in all, would exist today for any planet in the universe, besides planet Earth. He says, by chance, without divine design. He said, assuming there are 10 to the 22nd power planets in the universe, that's at least one planet for every star. We know that not every star has a planet, so that's being pretty generous. He says the answer is shocking, one chance in 10 to the power of 138, number one with 138 zeros after it. So that's 18 orders of magnitude greater than the 10 to the 120th that Steven Weinberg talked about. 10 to the 18th power is 1,000 quadrillion. Okay, so there are only about 10 to the 70th power atoms in the entire universe. In effect, there is zero chance that any planet in the universe would have the life-supporting conditions we have unless there is an intelligent designer behind it all. Now, Roger Penrose is a world-class physicist and mathematician. He certainly excels me in every way in physics and mathematics. I love mathematics because, for one thing, it's a friend that never lies to me, okay? Unlike the politicians who lie to me all the time. You know, turn on the television and I get assaulted with lies. They don't always lie, though. I want to make that clear. It's only when their lips are moving. Remember that, okay? Anyway, when their lips aren't moving, you're safe. But I love mathematics because it always tells me the truth. You know, I mean, if I'm running the calculation properly, it will tell me the truth whether I like it or not. You know, if I'm balancing my checkbook and the math shows you're way overdrawn, I don't like hearing that. But I know if I've done the calculation properly, it's telling me the truth whether I like it or not. Unfortunately, mathematics, which is the handmaiden of science and the most important tool in all of science, has been categorically discarded by many physicists and mathematicians because it shows their belief about the evolution of the cosmos and life and man doesn't make sense mathematically. It should be considered impossible. Now, Roger Penrose, Oxford physicist Roger Penrose, said one parameter, the phase space volume, required fine-tuning to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 multiplied by itself 10 to the 123rd power times. This showed, he said, the precision needed to set the universe on its course. Now, all those other big numbers we've talked about, as impossible as they are, pale in comparison to this number. And like I say, he's a much better mathematician than I, so I'm not going to challenge his figures, but I challenge why he doesn't accept what math is telling him here about the impossibility of this happening by chance. This number is inconceivably huge. If all the books that were ever written in the entire history of the world had blank pages and they were typed with nothing but zeros on those pages, it wouldn't begin to hold the number of zeros in this number. Now, this number is expressed very compactly here in scientific notation. 10 raised to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That's a very compact way of stating a number that would literally be impossible to type out longhand. He even admitted that if you had to type it out longhand, even if you filled the entire universe with reams of paper, every paper typed front and back with zeros, so it filled the entire physical space of the entire known universe with these pages of typed zeros, it still would not be enough zeros to express in longhand how big this number is. And yet, knowing that, he still says it must have happened, because after all, we do exist, and we just know we could not have been created. You see, I think his philosophy is messing with his science and his mathematics. His philosophy is blinding them to what real science, real mathematics is telling us. Naturalism doesn't work. The odds against it are so infinitesimal, nobody would stake their life on it. Who would stake your life on odds that were 1 trillion to 1? This is inconceivably huger than that. Now, Discover magazine therefore said, the universe is unlikely, very unlikely, deeply, shockingly unlikely. What are they talking about? They're talking about the fact that this discovery of fine-tuning is so great that it could not have happened by chance if there's only one universe. There has to be a fine-tuner, there has to be a creator, so that's pretty shocking to them. Now, physicist Brandon Carter, back in the 70s, coined, using the Greek word anthropos for man, he coined the phrase the anthropic principle, which basically is the principle that says the universe appears to be purposefully fine-tuned for human life to be possible. Now, this is despised by many materialists because, according to the evolutionary view, we're just a quirk of nature. We're just a tiny little, product of chance in this vast universe. We're so tiny and insignificant, we're just here by accident. And yet this seems to indicate the whole universe was thought out and incredibly fine-tuned with us in mind, because everything's there to make it possible for us to exist. And if it was just slightly changed, we could not exist in this universe. Now, Professor Leonard Susskind, who is professor of theoretical physics at Stanford University and an atheist evolutionist, he admits that the extreme fine-tuning of the universe represents, quote, a cataclysm for physicists, and the only way that we know how to make sense of it is through the reviled and despised anthropic principle. Notice the venom and the hate, reviled and despised. Well, they can't stand the fact that the universe appears to be not a product of chance, a product of fine-tuned design, which happens to be designed with a purpose, and the purpose is us of all things. Exactly what the Bible has told us for thousands of years. In the 20th and 21st century, we have caught up with that truth. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, so is the universe, so that we can exist. Now, how in the world do you get out of this? They get out of this by clutching at straws, by appealing to a theory which is unknowable and unprovable. They say maybe out there's a virtually infinite number of universes outside of our universe. We can't see them, we can't test them. Even if we could see a few of them, even if we could see 1 trillion of them, that wouldn't be enough. There has to be a virtual infinite number. How could you ever prove something like that scientifically? It really has no scientific proof to it. It's clutching at straws to try to get out of this predicament. But here in Discover magazine, under the article, A Universe Built for Us, the article says, on the other hand, if there is no multiverse, that's the idea of, a virtual infinite number of universes outside of our universe. If there is no multiverse, where does that leave physicists? If there is only one universe, and that's all we can see, Carr says, you might have to have a fine-tuner. The very thing they don't want to think, oh my gosh, you might have to have a fine-tuner, a creator. But if you don't want God, you'd better have a multiverse. I mean, it's not even subtle anymore. Again, as I said at the beginning, evolution appears to be believed primarily not because of all the evidence for it. They say even if all the evidence is against it, it's true. So evidence really doesn't seem to bother them one way or the other. It's all about what they don't want to believe, and that's God and creation. So if you don't want God, it's not a scientific question, it's a philosophical and religious question. If you don't want God, you better have this theory that cannot be proved by the scientific method. Wow, there it is. It really boils down to a philosophical rejection of the possibility of God, not because of any evidence at all, but because of their philosophical bias, bigotry, and prejudice against God, which is really tragic. Now then, cosmologist Ed Harrison, I thank God that there are some world-class scientists who at least will acknowledge the evidence for design. He said, here is the cosmological proof of the existence of God. The design argument of Paley, updated and refurbished. The fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie, or in other words, face value evidence of deistic design. In other words, designed by an almighty deity or creator. Sir Fred Hoyle, who prior to his death actually, through mathematics, came to the conclusion there must be a God, a creator. He gave up his atheism. But he didn't take the next step and seek a personal relationship with God, which is really where you get eternal life. But he admitted a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. It's under the control of sustained miracles, which we call laws, that make everything run decently and in order because God is not an author of confusion. Now, his colleague, Harvard astronomy professor Owen Gingerich, said this. He said, Fred Hoyle and I differ on lots of questions, but on this we agree. A common sense and satisfying interpretation of our world suggests the designing hand of a super intelligence. Indeed, who can doubt that if you look at it objectively? Now, the Nobel laureate Arno Penzias, many people say, well, there aren't any Nobel Prize winners that believe in intelligent design and creation. Well, if you look at Nobelists.net on the internet, there's at least 27 Nobel Prize winning scientists from the 20th and 21st century who do. and many of them even give a Christian testimony. Some of them are just theists. They believe in a creator, but not the God of the Bible or Jesus Christ, but many of them do also. Arno Penzias said, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seems to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Well, here's a Nobel Prize winner not afraid to use the supernatural word. Now, Albert Einstein is undoubtedly the most famous Nobel Prize winning scientist in history. He was definitely not a Christian, or even a believer in Yahweh, the God of his Jewish heritage, but he was definitely not an atheist, and he would not allow atheists to quote him in support of atheism. But he did acknowledge there had to be an intelligent power, a creator God behind the universe. He said, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we with our modest powers must feel humble. Many scientists today refuse to humble themselves under the mighty hand of God. But Einstein said he felt humbled when he looked at the universe that God had created. He also said, the deeper one penetrates into nature's secrets, the greater becomes one's respect for God. He also said, I want to know how God created this world. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details. Thus echoing the famous sentiment of Johannes Kepler, who said, as a scientist, I am merely trying to think God's thoughts after him. Finally, Einstein said, in view of such harmony in the cosmos, which I, with my limited human mind, am able to recognize, there are yet people who say there is no God. But what really makes me angry is that they quote me for the support of such views. Well, he said he was not going to allow himself to be quoted in favor of atheism. He was not an atheist, but he made the fatal mistake of not seeking a personal relationship with God. See, it's not enough to acknowledge God exists. You know, the Bible says, you believe that there is but one God, you do well. But remember, the demons also believe that there's one true God, and they tremble at the thought. See, they don't deny the existence of God, the demons don't, but they don't submit to him. They don't have a personal relationship with him. And the scripture says to know him intimately in a personal relationship, that is eternal life. Not just acknowledging that he exists, but to enter into that personal relationship which we can through the shed blood of Jesus Christ, through the gospel of Jesus Christ. So in conclusion, we find that something eternal caused the space-time-matter continuum of this universe to come into existence. There are two options to choose from. An eternal, omnipotent creator, something that explains everything to the minutest detail. No contradiction anywhere with the primary law of cause and effect. And this creator has not been silent. He has shown up in history in the person of Jesus Christ and demonstrated the credentials that showed that he was who he claimed to be, the creator manifest in human flesh. We do have the other option, or eternal, impotent nothing. And tragically, many of our top scientists today, even like Stephen Hawking, are saying it's more reasonable to believe everything came from nothing than everything came from the most adequate cause that you could ever imagine, an omniscient, omnipotent creator. You know, Stephen Hawking, his first wife, was a Christian, and she wrote an autobiography about her life with Stephen Hawking, and she tried to witness to him, tried to get him to believe the Bible and accept a relationship with Jesus Christ. And at one point she says, why can't you just believe in God? And why can't you just stand up and tell the world, I believe in God? And Stephen Hawking said, oh, what would my friends and my professional colleagues think of me if I said I believed in God? Oh, I would be so embarrassed. I just couldn't do that. Tragically, like the Pharisees, he loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. And yet, the price was paid for him. Jesus bore his sins in his body on the tree. Jesus paid the eternal redemption price for him. He could have a place in the new heaven and new earth where righteousness dwells. No more sorrow, no more sickness, no more pain, no more tears, no more curse, no more death. He could have a new eternal resurrection body. They'll never get old and sick and die. He'll never have to be in a wheelchair again. He could dance a jig for joy for all eternity. And yet he sits there, a pathetic figure, withering away in a wheelchair and concerned about nothing but having the praise of his professional colleagues and his friends. Well, you know, the scripture says, what shall it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? All the money and fame and fortune in this world will never buy your way into heaven, and it sure won't buy your way out of hell. Nothing but the love and the blood of Jesus can do that. But I ask you to pray for him. You know, he's making a circuit now from what I've heard. It's hearsay, so I can't say for sure. But in his lecture circuit, he's now offering to unbaptize people. You know, so he apparently has some vendetta against Christian baptism and Christian commitment. Pray for him. You know, he should have died years ago. God's keeping him alive for some reason. You know, pray that he will come to his senses and be a real scientist and believe in what the facts show. It is a reasonable faith, far more reasonable than materialism, to believe in an eternal creator God. There will, of course, be a day of reckoning, as it says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20. For ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible nature and attributes, that is, his eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made, his handiworks. Tonight we've looked at his biggest handiwork, the cosmos itself. So men are without excuse, altogether without any defense or justification. You know, God says in his word that his judgment is righteous and proportional. In other words, God will not judge people worse than what they deserve, nor will he judge them better than what they deserve. Everybody will get exactly perfect justice. That's why everything is recorded, so there'll be no mistakes. Perfect justice, even the secrets of men's heart will be revealed on the judgment day. You know, we have the Fifth Amendment that says you can't be compelled to be a witness against yourself. God has no Fifth Amendment. He says the secret thoughts and meditations, the motivations of your heart will all be laid bare. And who can escape a judgment like that where even your secret thoughts are revealed? The real truth. Thank God for the blood of Jesus to cleanse all of our sins. That's how we'll stand on that day. But in this regard, God will probably be more lenient with Charles Darwin than he will with his contemporaries today. Because the Bible says those who sinned willfully, knowing exactly what they were doing, will be punished by many blows. They'll be beaten with many stripes. Whereas those who sinned more in ignorance, who didn't know as much what they were doing, they will be beaten, so to speak, with few blows. They'll have less of a severe punishment. You know, Darwin on the judgment day say, Lord, be lenient on me. After all, I didn't know about the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning of the universe. I didn't know about DNA, RNA, ribosomes, proteins. I didn't know about all these amazing discoveries of the complexity of life that we found out in the 20th and 21st century. Yeah, well, there was a lot he did know that he did reject. He'll be held accountable, but what will the scientists today say on the judgment day? Oh, God, be lenient. After all, we didn't know anything. They are a generation of scientists who knows more than any other generation in history. And the Bible says, to whom much is given, of the same shall much be required. I would be shaking in my boots if I was one of them. God is just, but he can't grant clemency and leniency when they know so much and still reject the truth. Those who sin willfully, knowing what they're doing, will be beaten with many blows, a severe judgment. I pray that they'll come to their senses and receive no blows. Jesus took the blows for us. Jesus took the judgment for us. That's the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, I thank you very much for your attention. I'll be out at the DVD table if you have any final questions. Appreciate you coming out tonight. Hope we'll see you tomorrow. We'll have Nate close you out, and thank you very much.